Howdy, all you delicious people. When kind of going through this show, I have kind of heard some rumblings of this show. Every once in a while, eventually I'll see, like, what is the new hit thing, because everybody will, like, not stop talking about it, or it seems like there's slowly but surely people, they're just like, hey, you know what, I just bizarrely caught this show called Yellowstone. I'm like, what? Like, what is this show about, or why are people invested in it? Not why should I care? I'm just figuring out why is everyone invested in this show. And so once that pattern starts to emerge, I'm like, well, hey, why not just go into the show and start talking about it and at least watch an episode or two or see what goes through within the inception of people being invested with this show. Ultimately, knowing full well that right out of the gate, I'm going to talk about this show in, of course, very cryptic like sense, then eventually bust out that double five, and then eventually go into spoilers about this show. I'm also going to kind of cryptically lean into some of the stuff going on into this show so people can understand what this show is if they've never heard of it in their life, or otherwise they're just kind of wanting to lean in to kind of hear a little bit here and there, but dare say kind of still in a very cryptic like motion. So, going into this episode, there is some shock value that I thought was like, whoa. Going into this one episode, I was like, man, there's a lot of crazy things going on in this episode. I'm not really quite understanding what's going on at some portions of time because ultimately there's a lot of just bargaining of seemingly lands and cattle and stuff along those lines. It's a lot of dynasty-esh like things. Do you guys remember who shot JR? I still don't even know who shot JR because ultimately at the end of the day, I never saw Dynasty. I was a little bit young and for that show, and ultimately to probably go through now just to figure out who shot JR. I know probably uh, flashback esh like nostalgia VH1 shows would probably tell you eventually who shot him. But at the end of the day, we're going to push on. Ultimately, knowing full well there is a very interesting cast going on to this show, even to the point of having simply Kevin Costner in this show. Knowing full well I've seen Kevin Costner do some like westerns and stuff like that, to ultimately see Kevin Costner very much be like just being a farm owner in this show, but it seems like he's doing much more than that. It seems like this is a guy that otherwise wants to like buy the world and then eventually have to like go through any like several rungs of going and shaking hands with everybody because ultimately he has to seemingly know everyone in this town and seemingly have to work with everybody in this town to where ultimately he is telling his oldest son if he wants to take on the family business that he's got to do just more than whatever is on the barn. So we have it to where like the very first episode kind of goes into there being some real back and forth struggle with seemingly everybody wanting to do their own things or ultimately feel like they own the rights to certain things. And there seems to be very much a tug and pull with the Native Americans, who, of course, me, myself personally, have some percentage, very small percentage ancestry with Native Americans. So hopefully, me saying the word Native American doesn't offend them. Um, but ultimately, like seeing how like Native Americans are playing out, especially the chief that is ultimately talking to the senator, and him talking at first that he thought of who he was before, but then realized who he actually really prominently was, and how ultimately how he kind of breaks down things to this senator was kind of very interesting to me, and and I'm trying to very much talk about this very cryptically here. how we also have, like, I think the very much interesting tug and pull journey is with one of Kevin Costner's sons, Casey. That seems to be in a very much Romeo and Juliet kind of West Side Story kind of uh, like a man of two worlds. And ultimately, he is very much saying that he is like a part of the Native Americans because he technically is, but he is also, of course, going to also protect his own family, which is also Kevin Costner's family. And it's kind of a very interesting tug and pull here. We also have it to where we have a a interesting way to see how Kevin Costner is seemingly like going throughout this entire like portions of, like, it seems like Kevin Costner has to be everywhere. Like, good God. Like, to see him seemingly, like, do all these transitions that he has to do in seemingly one episode, like, man, this guy has to go, this guy has to go here, and then, okay, I'm going to spend a little time here, but then eventually I gotta jump on this helicopter to fly all the way here just to go to this one, um, just to go to this one little uh, like arrangement where I got to shake hands with people and do some a little bit of business and talk to the people of the town, to hopefully get out of that and then eventually transition somewhere else. And then, like, good God, to see all the work that Kevin Costner has to transition and put in to this one episode, I'm like, good grief. Like, you would think all the stuff that Kevin Costner does in probably one whole day of flying here, getting on a horse here, riding out, like, good God, man. Like, him having to shake hands and kiss babies throughout this entire episode is crazy to ultimately see uh, who he's trying to sway onto his side to otherwise very much uh, keep everyone happy. And then plus also we have Wes Bentley, who I've seen in Ghost Rider, ultimately, and also the final girl. We have him as Jamie, who is this lawyer for his father, and to ultimately see it to where we have it to where Kevin Costner or John Dutton ultimately is consistently, like, throughout the entire day needing to consult with Jamie consistently and try to otherwise kind of uh, keep his enemies at bay, to otherwise, well, they're not exactly enemies, it's just people who they think they own what could quite possibly be his stuff, but is kind of like in between, like let's just say, like, basically, like, one cow could be between two states of things, and so ultimately two people think they own one cow, but this one cow is in two different states. So, uh, like, one person thinks that they own one half of a cow because they're in its state, but ultimately the other person can claim that, oh, well, no, I own this cow because he's on my side of my state. So it's kind of this, it's a lot of tug and war. It's a lot of people ultimately thinking that they can drop in and do their own things, and Kevin Costner does not like that or doesn't feel it's right. We ultimately have Danny Houston, who ultimately was from Wolverine Origins, or you might have seen him in any litany of several projects. Um, he ultimately plays a man called Danny Jenkins in this show. Ultimately, this seems to be a guy that otherwise is much more famous in this show, or ultimately much more famous to the people. It seems that he is a person that is very much wanting to drop down chemicals and stuff on certain kind of products and stuff like that. And Kevin Costner doesn't want him to get his way. And so basically, we have this struggle of that going on, and there's just a lot to process, and there's a lot to go on, and plus you get to slowly but surely within this episode see more and more Kevin Costner's family kind of pile up and just be like, man, Kevin Costner has a big family in this episode. So going full well, there's probably going to be some portions of this review that I'm probably going to kind of. This is a really long episode, and plus there's also just a lot of technical talk that I'm probably not going to go in depth on, and ultimately we're not going to take an hour and a half to try to talk about this entire episode. So there's going to be some stuff that I'm going to skim a lot. There's some stuff that might seem much more important than others. But at the end of the day, I think it's about roughly that time again to go into spoiler territory. So let's bust out that double five. Yeah, it's a lot of talk about land, or how basically it's a lot of talk about like what people think that they own or deserve, or like it's a lot about that. So ultimately people might not enjoy this show because of that, or ultimately to me it seems like a lot of stuff about red tape to where the point to where people have to do like court hearings and trials and stuff like that to ultimately figure out like where that of which that they should just be like, yeah, well, I want to put certain like I want to own this land to be able to do this, and you ultimately have Wes or Jamie ultimately uh, trying to say it's like, well, technically you can do it what you want, but not in the way that you really want it done. If anything, just figure out a way to like keep doing what you're doing, but in a different way. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So the opening of this show has this seemingly giant pileup going onto this road. We ultimately have Kevin Costner, who we find out is kind of serenading a horse to ultimately tell him that he will give him peace, and then shoots him. And I'm like, oh my god! But then, like, realizing it's like, well, that's a mercy that he's trying to give him. And because ultimately because Kevin Costner is just walking through seemingly this car pileup as we are just like, what the heck is going on? And we're ultimately just kind of, I'm so left in so much confusion. And so ultimately, we have to where Kevin Costner's like head is like gashed. Ultimately, he has to get like it's sewn together in this and that in this episode. So we have to where seemingly because Kevin Costner is trying to shake hands and kiss babies, so and he's got to be seemingly everywhere in this episode. So ultimately, that would easily lead to a car pileup and him being in an accident at some point. So we have to where ultimately we are showcasing that the Native Americans and seemingly Kevin Costner's family are battling for cattle, because ultimately they deem that, like, Native Americans deem that there are portions of lands that they think are actually just theirs. And because reasonably, we have the chief that ultimately talks to the senator and kind of mentions how, like, what she takes for granted, that she gets to be able to drive these roads or ultimately enjoy these kind of just very much um, portions of land that were actually at some point, of course, on his reservations or just owned by him, owned by the Native Americans. And because, of course, reasonably when looking at it, like, Pilgrim, or the whole Pilgrim Native American thing was basically that Native Americans were here first, and then eventually Pilgrims come in, and then eventually that ends up the way that ends up. So when going through here, we reasonably have it to where ultimately it's a battle for land. It's a battle for ultimately having people coming in and doing what they want with cattle, and ultimately just doing whatever they want. Seems that, like I said, kind of Dan Jenkins' thing is that ultimately he seems to be some kind of famous person of this town, ultimately juxting Kevin Costner's character about that Kevin Costner's character is jealous because he's really not as famous as Dan Jenkins is within this company or within this town. And so ultimately the real reason why Dan Jenkins can't come in and do whatever he wants is because ultimately just Kevin Costner is bitter about what he's doing with lands or what he's doing with cattle or what he's doing with whatever. And so ultimately he's not going to just let him slide. So we ultimately have it to where also we have uh, Rip Wheeler, who is ultimately his real actor's name is Cole, and Rip Wheeler ultimately goes through and just brands people, which I thought was very odd within this episode. I thought that was the oddest thing in this episode. So we have it to where Rip Wheeler like brands somebody in this episode and forces them to work with him, because I guess anybody that is a thief or steals from this family ends up getting branded with the Yellowstone like brand. And so then ultimately to see the reveal that we get at the very end of this episode is kind of interesting. So, and then bizarrely, like, Rip Wheeler ends up very much having his strife or bedroom business with Beth Dutton, which is, of course, the daughter of all the rest of these boys. So ultimately, we have it to where Kevin Costner is, of course, the father of seemingly three other boys that ultimately we'll get into in each progression. So Jamie Dalton ultimately is a lawyer that is very much having it out with ultimately this person about being able to build homes and stuff like that, to where ultimately uh, Jamie's answer is for him to just build condos at the very end of this. To ultimately, instead of building out, how about you just build up? And because ultimately, like, again, there's always just more and more fights of just oh, can we just give more land? How about we say no? So we ultimately have Kevin Costner who goes to his farm at portions of time when he's not every billion other hundreds of other places, and sees Casey Dutton, who is a horse wrangler, a horse whisperer, or a horse tamer, where seemingly he is trying very much to train a horse not to go all wild and buck people off and stuff like that. And so ultimately, everyone is telling him, it's like, well, yeah, you're not going to be able to tame this horse until you break its spirit. And Casey is defiantly like, no, like, I'm going to tame this horse without having to break its spirit. And so ultimately, we have this kind of like free Ash like character that comes with Casey. To ultimately, we find out that Casey is otherwise seemingly tied to a Native American woman. And this is where we have this kind of very much West Side Story, Romeo and Juliet thing going on, to where ultimately Casey is very much um, saying that, hey, I'm one of the Native Americans, but ultimately, when looking at it, he is also Kevin Costner's son. So it's very much struggle between ultimately the Native Americans and the Kevin Costner Ashlight family or the Dutton family about this struggle between cattle. And so how the Native Americans think that this cattle is theirs, but also so do the Dutton family, and to the point to where like the Dutton family at some points are seeing that their fences or their stuff like that is taken down because certain people think certain portions of land are there. So it's a struggle between land this entire time and what is exactly theirs. And so there's this back and forth ish like struggle. So and ultimately Casey is ultimately like right in the middle of everything to where to the portion of time to where ultimately the eldest Native American is telling Casey to go home, ultimately to go home to the Duttons, and Casey's like, well, like, but I'm one of you. I'm one of the Native Americans. Like I'm here by blood. Like I'm here by marriage. And ultimately the eldest Native American is like, well, it's like, no, sorry. Like you're Dutton. You're Dutton there, boy. So ultimately he has to just he's really still like very much playing the fence. But so we have to where ultimately Kevin Costner is kind of eventually having to where his oldest son is seemingly a person who holds a badge, and this badge very much is like basically like cementing of like land ownership and this and that, and how basically this guy is kind of like the policeman of his lands, I guess. So ultimately, we have to where Kevin Costner's oldest son is really very much taking part of the farm, but Kevin Costner is telling him, it's like, well, if you want to get my job, if you want to replace me, like you're doing it wrong. You're spending too much time on the farm and you're not spending it like shaking hands and kissing babies. Like you're you think that you're running the farm, but you're really not like running it. And So it's just kind of, it's really interesting to see how, like, the perspective of just like, well, the barn isn't the only thing that you have to do within this job. There's more to it. There's the whole political spectrum of things, to make others happy, to otherwise be the thing that you're not doing. So ultimately, all the while, Kevin Costner and his oldest son eventually are kind of checking some of the herd, and it seems like one of the herd ends up um, being pregnant and delivers a child, which they forcibly have to kind of pull out of her, pull out of the cow. So ultimately, it ends up towards the later portion of this episode where we start to find out some um, kind of backstory of some of these characters here and there once they mix themselves together. Some of the brothers, the sisters, and stuff like that. We ultimately have three of the brothers all going into uh, the forest together and just kind of have a fun little time. It's kind of funny to see, or it was kind of funny the moment where we have Jamie getting up at like 9:30 in the morning, and Beth coming to speak to him, ultimately telling him it's like, oh hey, like you getting up at 9:30 in the morning, and he's like, and Jamie's like, it's on a Saturday, and she's like, well hey, that's nothing on a farm reservation or a farm, on a barn. So basically, Jamie starts to realize, especially with his day off, I guess from being a lawyer for once, ultimately it's making him realize that hey, maybe he should spend more time with his family, because ultimately it's like it's his day off for him technically. So, uh, with the exception of him consistently being a consultant for his father, seemingly 24/8, so, or 25/8, I should say. So we have to where seemingly the whole cattle thing is really coming to a head, and it's getting to the point to where fences are being pulled away from places to ultimately people have to crazily like figure out how to get their cattle back. And so it just gets to the point to where they're like, okay, like now it's time to have a stand. And so we have the oldest Dutton, who is kind of policing his land at night, and it seems like there is going to be very much a seemingly shootout, to where ultimately it kind of is between this whole cattle. There seems to be a shootout going on because ultimately, realistically, everybody's just like, well, how about we, like the Duttons are thinking about how about we scare the Native Americans away, and the Native Americans aren't going to be scared because really they do think that they own this, and they probably do. But so do the Duttons. So there's just this back and forth to the point of just it being to where um, shots are fired into the Dutton helicopter where Kevin Costner is, to where ultimately Kevin Costner in the helicopter is trying to scare the Native Americans away. All of this is all really and truly all scare tactics. The Duttons are trying to do. They're not trying to kill anybody. They're not trying to shoot anybody down. They're just trying to scare people. But ultimately, one of the Native Americans goes too far. Ultimately, ends up killing the oldest Dutton's son, and where Casey ultimately knocks this guy off his ass, and then ultimately tries to get to his brother that is bleeding out. So we ultimately have to where at the very end of this episode, we have a funeral for Kevin Costner's oldest son, ultimately leading us to probably assume that more than likely Casey is probably going to be the next heir of this farm, because when looking at it, who else is going to take on the mantle? Ultimately, Jamie is a attorney and stuff like that, and so ultimately, all the while, we eventually realistically just see it to where ultimately after this whole shootout and how Dutton's oldest son had died, basically the senator is really wanting to push, like, okay, we need to take this case to the highest level and finally get this resolved so that way we can kind of stop this bloodshed. And the chief is like, okay, great, I'm happy about this. So we have to where the Duttons are having a funeral for their son. Ultimately, it seems that people are still not really at first processing their brother's death. It seems like Casey is like hasn't even changed his clothes or anything like that. Within his funeral, he's just kind of just still at the same clothes that he wore the night before, holding his horse that he rode into the night before, just kind of really just at a loss. So we have to where ultimately uh, they go through this funeral. They do this. They do the whole funeral, and eventually, um, Kevin Costner meets Casey, who's ultimately still kind of godsmacked from the night before. Ultimately, brings Kevin Costner brings Casey's horse in to eventually within the barn break down and get emotional and just start crying about the loss of his son, because ultimately he needed to be strong for everybody, and ultimately he also, I think, needed, like, he's needed to put on this performance for so long that at the most point he needs to of course have an heir for this barn, and he's realizing that his oldest son was going to be the one for this. And so like a lot of stuff is hitting him really hard, like the whole beginning of this where he probably assumed that he was going to lose his life through that hellacious pile up, and just ultimately kind of really realizing how close he was to probably also losing his life along with his son, because his helicopter had gotten almost seemingly tried to be shot down. So we have it to where ultimately that is where eventually the episode ends. And yeah, just kind of pushing through a lot of this show, pushing through a lot of things. The last thing that we end up really seeing is that Casey has a Yellowstone brand on his chest when talking to his girl. Ultimately, her asking her asking if he is okay. And so eventually, when she leaves, we eventually see the Yellowstone branding on Casey. So, very interesting aspect of some things going on here, but I don't think I went too far into detail, so I do apologize, and I hope otherwise people are just like, yeah, you went too generic enough on this review. and this and that. So I'm not gonna like it because I apologize. I hope everybody likes this review. But yeah, I'm not quite sure how I feel about this show. Like there is a lot of shock value moments that kept me intrigued, but I don't know. I want to see. I guess I'll probably check out if, without a doubt, people are interested in hearing this review. I'll go into other episodes to see, like, eventually, like, where this goes. Because I'm kind of, like, there's a lot of shock value Ash like things that got me interested. Just like, okay, you got my attention. And so hopefully it keeps on that pattern. Um, Hopefully I can get to understand what is kind of going on because there's a lot of technical things going on here, a lot of technical jargon, a lot of technical talk. Where I'm just like, okay, I don't really like lawyer litigations and talking about this like technical farm ash like things, and I'm just like, Urgh. So at the end of the day, I think that's all I want to say about this very first review. I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.